Nobody talks about Vampire Reign with any kind of reverence, any sort of respect. Most wouldn't even regard it as a game worth ever playing, and I have to disagree with that, for a very specific reason. That being, it is absolutely one of the worst games at communicating what it wants to be and how it wants to do what it wants to do. But once you understand it, it makes vastly more sense.
I haven't completed my research yet, but I have formed a theory.
Like, understand, Famitsu gave this a 30 out of 40, which is not a bad rating. It seems to be primarily Western critics who really did not dig what Vampire Reign was trying to offer, and I can see why, because at the surface level, it looks like it's going to just be another Ubisoft-style stealth game. You know, crouch behind cover, stab everybody in the neck or what have you, or snipe them from long range, and just be this ultimate spying badass. That's not what Vampire Reign is ever interested in. It's actually very focused on trying to subvert those expectations, and I wouldn't say it's going for something like Spec Ops The Line, but it does aim for something more than just, well, I'm the all-American hero and I can do whatever the hell I want. Instead, you're pretty powerless. Regularly, a single enemy can kill you with ease. You have to be really strategic and tactical to actually catch a single enemy by surprise. And even then, it can be really tricky making it through that. You rarely have your allies on hand, which typically is excused for really ridiculous narrative reasons, but still, it fits the atmosphere of everything, and it's a very classic 90s style survival horror story, which is really how you should look at Vampire Reign. It is far more Resident Evil with vampires that just happens to control a bit like Splinter Cell. It is not just Splinter Cell versus vampires. Plus, the way you approach the world exploration, again, doesn't really aim for the Ubisoft sort of thing where you go for everything, collect everything, and just unlock the entire area until you're walking around scot-free. Instead, the emphasis is far more so about evading being around enemies, finding ways around the areas with the most activity, and as a result, feels a bit more like Mirror's Edge or Mark Echo's Getting Up. It's remarkable. It's not something that I was anticipating when I started playing the game, and it is an acquired taste. There is an odd difficulty curve where the first few levels are easily the hardest. Like, it first starts off with close to almost a 40-minute tutorial trying to explain very basic concepts, because clearly the team understood that they were throwing something new to players, but they didn't understand what they needed to explain versus what was painfully obvious, because, you know, being able to walk and move your camera, that's not really a new thing. That wasn't a new thing when this game came out, but they act like it's this brand new, amazing revelation. And I appreciate that they're trying to make it so that the whole experience is more accessible, but regardless, it's still just, it doesn't click quite like the way they wanted it to. That said, there are clever ideas they do need to express, like vampires having parental vampires, which isn't to say it's their dad, it's the person who bit them first and turned them into a vampire, and if you take out the parental vampire, boom, that chain effect takes out a whole bunch of other vamps at the same time. And that's fantastic. That's a really neat way of effectively rewarding the player for conserving their resources, which you have to do because pistol shots are basically useless. An entire clip of an assault rifle is required to take down a single enemy, and if you have to reload, you're dead. You're just already dead. And pretty much any other equipment that easily takes out the vampires is only given out during specific circumstances. Most notably the sniper rifle, which is remarkably satisfying to use because you can really catch a bunch of vampires without warning, and those are the moments where you get some catharsis. And you will want catharsis, because if you get detected, there's no going back from that. The vampires are not Metal Gear Solid enemies. They detect you, they go for the kill. They will leap across whole buildings to hunt you down and rip out your throat in a bloody death cutscene. It is in no way chill. Vampire Reign is never, ever chill. But that's oddly comforting after a while. At first it can be a bit nerve-wracking as you very carefully wander around, especially since there's only limited checkpoints, but Once you figure out that turning on your one vision mode marks enemies, and you realize that you can use different height levels and various buildings to your advantage, it stops being an overly crushing experience. Like, a lot of the critics I've seen who talk about this game on YouTube describe it as the most impossible game to play, but that's not really the case. In fact, the boss battles typically are incredibly reasonable and easy to accomplish, and usually are built around a specific gimmick rather than just about spamming bullets. Save for the guy in the nightclub, who you weirdly do have to spam with a lot of bullets, but also make sure he walks very slowly into a bunch of pre-planted ultraviolet mines. And yes, ultraviolet mines are a thing that your squad mates get, but you don't. I won't call the experience perfect because, yeah, there's a lot of times where it's like, why don't I get this? Why do my teammates get to have all the ammo and the shotguns? Why can't I ever have this stuff? But understanding what they're going for tonally and thematically, it makes more sense. I do think you should have been able to carry equipment over between levels, but they don't for balancing reasons. Regardless, there's a lot of interesting ideas going on in Vampire Reign. And weirdly, it was also aiming high for its multiplayer content. Like, almost every achievement on Xbox relates to its competition mode, which included a mode where you could play as one of the undead vampire people, because they're kind of like zombies, but they're also supposed to be vampires. There's a reason they just call them Night Walkers, because they're not very traditional vampires, or even, you know, some of the more modern interpretations. I think it would be most accurate to describe them as ghouls, but for some reason they didn't just, you know, call them ghouls. Maybe because of Grad by the Ghoulies, who knows. Night Walkers isn't a terrible name, but I digress. Regardless, it does work as its core premise. That's the fascinating thing about Vampire Reign. It is not going to be a game for everyone. It never was going to be. And I think it's best that it doesn't try to be for everyone, because as a result, it's highly distinct and fascinating to play. You don't see games like this exist anymore, and it's kind of amazing to just witness all of this playing out, to see all these different possibilities for how to handle a scenario, because they did make every single level be set in a sandbox environment. It's not just a bunch of linear scenarios. In fact, they go out of their way to ensure that every scenario has multiple routes and options. It's just that a lot of them are either blocked off by a vampire or otherwise has some different variable going on to offset it. Maybe you won't be able to get certain equipment that you wanted if you go that way, or maybe you'll have to expend something so that you can actually get past a certain vampire or some such. Or you'll need to make sure to not trigger something else, because there are optional triggerable things in the environment, like getting a vampire to leap out of a sewer and start patrolling, where at one point he wasn't, thus creating a new hazard that you can avoid by just not going around where that trigger would be set off, not making him aware that you would even be there. It's fascinating. It really, that is the word that best describes Vampire Reign, is not cruel, not vindictive, but fascinating, because it is this toy box approach, but it doesn't let you play with everything. It's got a tiny bit of Hitman going on in there in terms of its level design, on top of everything else. There's a lot at play in one game here, and you don't usually see it this much being layered into a single experience. And it's for that reason that I don't hate it. I actually think that it's an interesting little hidden gem. Flawed gem, no question. The voice acting is terrible, the writing is all over the place. It is immensely long for how little it has to actually say. Like, seriously, the first, 6 hours are basically confirming that the advanced team died, getting their equipment, and figuring out what the hell to do. This is a surprisingly long game for a stealth horror experience. And that's not even counting the optional challenges, which let you play with your squad mates and do additional tutorials that will inform you about more things. Oddly, these optional tutorials tend to be better designed than the main ones that you're forced to go through. I really feel like a lot of this game fell apart in the cutting room. I can't help but wonder how much more concisely this game could have been designed had they not forced certain stages and just relied on others. Granted, there's also a tutorial challenge mission where you descend a rope and walk to a van, and that's all you do. Like I said, it is not perfect. It is a game with very mixed priorities that clearly something weird was going on behind the scenes. There was some problem with figuring out how to communicate to players what they actually wanted from the game. But even if that is the case, I still think it's worth playing. I'm not sure I ever could have justified spending $60 on it like they wanted at launch, but I got my copy for like $7, and yeah, it works very well. It's absolutely a game that I do recommend trying, and I have to thank my friend Hidden Object Guru, who you should also check out on YouTube, for recommending that I take a look at this one, because I really wasn't sure. My only exposure to the game before now was the Unskippable video on it, where they lampooned the astounding opening cutscene, and it's a sight to behold. Just, you know, how over the top yet also deadpan this story is. It is something else. It's still genuinely interesting, it's just also so bizarre. But yeah, even with the oddities, even with the oversights and problems with introducing what it actually wants to be, if you come into Vampire Reign expecting a stealth game where you actually try to ghost as much as possible, where fighting is your last resort, and where you're always trying to conserve resources as much as possible, you should have a good time. I especially think that if you like, say, Death to Spies, this might be more up your alley. It's a shame it never came to PC, as I imagine the controls would be a lot better then, but regardless, it still is an enjoyable time, and yeah, give it a whirl. If you'd like to hear more thoughts from me on Vampire Reign, I actually wrote a column on it earlier for Second Look on The Escapist, so there'll be a link for that in the description below and a card popping up above. Thank you all for watching. This has been Unabridged Gamer, off the cuff. Videos like these are made possible thanks to your generous contributions to the Unabridged Gamer Patreon.